Hi guys, welcome to this video on the structure of blood vessels. We're going to take some time just to have a little look at the different kinds of vessels that we've got that carry blood throughout the body, and also we're going to contextualize it initially by just talking a little bit about blood flow. So in this diagram we're just going to talk about how blood flows through the system. We've got the heart in the middle there, and we've got the lungs. You'll notice that I've put the heart and the lungs a bit closer together because they are in fact closer together. The blood has to travel much less distance to get from the heart to the lungs and back again than it does to go from the heart to the rest of the body, which is represented in this diagram by the muscle icon on the right hand side. So as blood flows around the body, we're going to start off by tracking it from the heart. So initially, deoxygenated blood in the heart travels to the lungs, which are nice and close by. That deoxygenated blood, shown by the blue arrow to represent the fact that it's low in oxygen, travels from the heart, the right side of the heart, to the lungs. And when it arrives at the lungs, it picks up oxygen. And so from the lungs, it then returns back to the heart, but now it's full of oxygen, so we're going to represent it with a red arrow to show that it's oxygenated blood. Now the blue and the red aren't the actual colours of the blood, of course. The blood is always red. The reason we use blue and red is just for diagrams. So don't be confused and think that when blood is deoxygenated it is actually blue. It isn't. It's just a duller kind of red. But that just doesn't show up very well on diagrams. So we use the blue for deoxygenated, we use the red for oxygenated. So this oxygenated blood has now returned from its little short journey to the lungs. It's returned to the heart, and it's now in the left hand side of the heart, ready to be ejected from the heart to the working muscles. So out it goes to the working muscles. It's still oxygenated. That's why it's come to the heart from the lungs to be sent to the working muscles for cellular respiration, bringing that oxygen along. Arrives at the muscles extract the oxygen that they need for cellular respiration to keep contracting and so on, and then the blood continues on its journey back to the heart. So you can see there's almost like a double circuit going on here: heart, lungs, heart, then heart, muscles, heart, and the cycle continues almost as a figure eight kind of cycle. Any arteries that are, or any blood vessels, let me be more specific, any blood vessels that are moving away from the heart are referred to as arteries. So it may or may not be the case that the arteries are carrying oxygenated or deoxygenated blood. Usually, since the vast majority of arteries are going from the heart to the body, the vast majority of arteries do in fact carry oxygenated blood. But that's not actually the definition of an artery. An artery is simply a vessel that is moving away from the heart. And you can see that clearly on the diagram. The arrows that I've labelled as arteries are clearly going away from the heart. And I remember it by the fact that arteries begins with the letter A, as does the word away. That may help, I don't know. Secondly, any vessels, whether or not they have got oxygenated or deoxygenated blood, any vessels that are going towards or into the heart, we refer to those as veins. And the way I remember this is that a vein contains the word in. V-E-I-N-S. Vein is into the heart. And again, oxygenated or deoxygenated is not the reason, is not the way that we categorize these. If the vessel is heading into the heart, it's a vein. Okay, so we've got arteries going away from the heart. Wherever they're going, if they're going away, it's an artery. And wherever they're going, if they're going into the heart or towards the heart, it's a vein. The other vessels we're going to talk about in the next few slides are help us to understand what happens when the arteries bring the blood to their sort of target location. So in this case, when the arteries arrive at the lungs, how exactly is that blood, how does it come into contact with either the lungs or the muscle? How is it transferred through the lungs or through the muscle, and then how does it come out the other side into veins? And that's done by a specialized set of vessels that we refer to as capillaries. So blood flow happens in this order: heart, arteries, lungs. Then the capillaries transfer the blood from the arteries to the veins, which then flow back to the heart. And then from the heart to the muscle, the blood travels through arteries. Then it kind of dissipates through the capillaries before re-emerging kind of on the other side of the system, or the other side of the muscles, into the veins, which then return that blood to the heart. And the whole cycle just continues round and round. So let's look at the arteries, let's look at the capillaries, and let's look at the veins and figure out how they're specialized to do their particular jobs, because each of those is somewhat different. So beginning with arteries then, you'll note initially that I've referred to arteries in the heading, arteries and arterioles. And I don't want to get you caught up on the terminology, except to simply explain that arterioles are small arteries. So as the arteries, as you can imagine, split and branch off, as they get smaller, they become what are known as arterioles. But in terms of structure and everything else we're going to talk about, they are essentially the same thing as arteries. They're still carrying blood away from the heart. They're still, for the most part, carrying oxygenated blood, and for the most part, they're structured in the same way. So let's look at arteries and arterioles together. So as we've already said, arteries begin with the letter A, which reminds me that arteries go away from the heart. And remember that that means that they don't always carry oxygenated blood, but that they usually do. The exception is the pulmonary artery. And again, you'll remember from other videos that the pulmonary artery, the word pulmonary relates to the lungs. So the artery that is going away from the heart but going to the lungs is the only artery that doesn't carry oxygenated blood. It doesn't carry oxygenated blood. It's carrying deoxygenated blood, but it's going away from the heart, so it's still classed as an artery. The key features of arteries are that the walls tend to be thick and very muscular, so there's a large content of muscle in the wall of the artery, and there are various reasons for that. And the main reason for that is because they have to cope with the highest level of pressure in the whole of the system. So as the heart contracts to eject blood out of the heart, that pressure that's created as the blood is ejected through the arteries, that pressure is at the highest as it leaves the heart into the arteries, as it's going away. Okay, so particularly the aorta, which is the largest and thickest and most muscular of the arteries, that's that first artery that leaves the heart. So as soon as the blood leaves the heart, it goes straight into the aorta, that first main artery that's off on its way to the body and to the muscles, is the most elastic and the thickest of the arteries, because it's got to cope with the massive pressure that's created when the heart contracts to send blood all around the body. So arteries and also arterioles are structured very similar. They're thick, they've got these muscular walls so that they can cope with the high pressure that's created by the heart contracting and sending blood flying through these arteries. And as the blood moves through the system, the pressure slowly drops, and that becomes significant in just a moment. So the arteries are going away from the heart and bringing blood through vessels to either the lungs or the muscles, and obviously the various other organs, but we're not going to focus on those in this video. So what happens when they get there? As blood arrives at the lungs and at the heart, it arrives from arterioles. So you remember that I said arterioles are just small arteries. The arteries have split and branched and split and branched and so on, and now have arrived at their destination. They've arrived at the organ where the oxygen is supposed to be being either dropped off or picked up. So dropped off in the case of muscles, picked up in the case of the lungs. So they've arrived from these arterioles into this dense network located in the tissues where the oxygen is either being picked up or dropped off. So let's be specific about this. We're talking about the lungs on the one side of the diagram that we've just looked at, and we're talking about the muscles and obviously the other organs on the other side of the diagram. And this dense capillary network, sometimes called a capillary bed, is embedded in the tissue. So that might be embedded in the muscle tissue itself, through, between, around, so that there's maximum opportunity for the oxygen that's being carried in the blood to be diffused or dispersed into the tissue. And in the case of the lungs, the maximum opportunity for the oxygen to be picked up and the carbon dioxide to be dropped off by dispersing it through and in and around the lungs, the alveoli that you can learn about in another video. So the purpose of the capillaries is to enable gaseous exchange. This is the place where the gases, that oxygen and that carbon dioxide that we focus on in terms of respiration, those gases can be swapped. So at the muscle, oxygen in, carbon dioxide out, and then at the lungs, oxygen into the bloodstream, out of the alveoli, and the carbon dioxide into the alveoli and out of the bloodstream. So gaseous exchange takes place at the capillaries. It doesn't take place through the arteries. It doesn't take place through the veins. It happens at the capillaries, and that's why we have this capillary network all in and around the tissue, so this gaseous exchange can take place. Well, how does it take place? It takes place because these capillaries have very thin walls. In fact, for the most part, these capillaries are a single cell thick. And so that really enables that gaseous exchange to take place rapidly. So the rapid uptake or drop off of oxygen and carbon dioxide, depending on where we're talking about, is enabled through these really thin capillary walls. And the other thing to note is that because these capillaries have been supplied with blood from arteries, they retain relatively high pressure. So the pressure is retained relatively high at this point. And once the capillaries then re-emerge from the tissue and start to join back together again, then the pressure starts to drop. And as they join back together again, they become no longer capillaries, but they become the next type of vessel that we're going to talk about in just a second. So arteries come from the heart. They're moving away from the heart. Those arteries split into arterioles. They split further when they arrive at their tissue that they're either dropping off or picking up the oxygen from and the carbon dioxide. Then they split into these capillaries, which are these tiny, really thin-walled vessels, still maintaining high pressure. That enables gaseous exchange, and then they start to join back together until finally we reach the last type of vessel. And that last type of vessel is veins. So again, you'll notice the heading here includes the idea of venules. We've got veins and venules, and venules are very similar to arterioles. Well, the relationship between veins and venules is basically the same as arteries and arterioles. A venule is just a little vein. So as blood flows through the capillary network, and let's say it's gone through the muscle, it's dropped off the oxygen that's required for muscular respiration, for muscular contraction and so on to produce the energy required. It's flowed through that capillary network. Those capillaries have started again to join back together to slightly larger capillaries, and then eventually they come out of the muscle tissue and start to join back together. Initially, as they join back together, they're still really small and thin. They're venules. And as the venules join back together and become thicker and wider and larger, those then are what we call veins. But both venules and veins are coming from the capillary bed back towards the heart. And so therefore, that is why we refer to them as veins. So you remember I said previously, a vein is any vessel that's going towards the heart, because it's got that word in. So the venules are just little veins. They join back together to make veins, and then veins finally eventually return blood to the heart. And the last vein is the vena cava, which you can find out about a little bit more in another video, in a previous video. The vena cava is the final vein that rejoins the heart and brings the blood back into the heart, ready to complete and continue the cycle. So the veins and venules are bringing blood back to the heart. Note just one more time that although for the most part, because they're heading back to the heart, back to the heart, for the most part, the blood that's contained in the veins is deoxygenated blood. But again, remember the pulmonary vein, because the pulmonary vein is that vein that goes into the heart from the lungs, the pulmonary vein in fact carries oxygenated blood because it's just picked it up from the lungs. So the classification is, it's more important as to whether or not it's going into or away from the heart. That determines whether we're talking about arteries or veins, not so much whether it's oxygenated or not. That's an important thing to remember. So how are veins different to arteries? They're still blood vessels, of course. They're still sort of roughly tube shaped, but there are some key differences. One of which is that veins and venules have really thin walls. There's not as much muscle tissue in a vein as there is in an artery, and part of the reason for that is because they don't need to produce the same volume of pressure, because the pressure they don't need to cope with the same volume of pressure. The greatest pressure comes in the arteries as the blood leaves the heart. By the time we get through the capillaries, the pressure has dropped and dropped and dropped. There's no need for the veins to maintain the same level of pressure, because the speed of blood returning to the heart is not as vital as the speed of blood. I mean, it's still important, but it's not as vital as the speed of blood from the heart. So thin walls are not a problem. We're just sending that blood back to the heart. So thin walls mean lower pressure. But lower pressure, what we don't want to happen in the case of lower pressure is we don't want blood just pooling in the veins. That is just gathering up because there's much less pressure gathering up, say in the feet if you're standing up or sitting down. You don't want blood pooling in your feet. There needs to be some way of getting that blood back up against the force of gravity, back up to the heart. So in spite of this lower pressure, there needs to be some system whereby blood can be sent back to the heart without it just pooling. And the way that the veins do this in a different way to the arteries is the veins have valves within them, and you can see that on the diagram there, a valve. So every few centimeters in large veins, or less than that in smaller veins, every now and again during the course of the blood flow, the blood will meet a valve, and the valve will stop the blood continuing on its way until there's sufficient blood arrived in the vein to have enough pressure to open the valve. So once the blood has kind of built up sufficiently in the vein behind a valve, it will push that valve door open, and the blood will flow through into the next little section of the vein. And so the amount of blood that's returning to the heart in a sedentary individual, or if you're not doing any exercise or you're just kind of asleep or whatever, there isn't a massive amount of blood returning to the heart. So this process happens really slowly. So the blood pools a little bit. Eventually there's enough for the blood to push open the valves, and it pushes open the valves and heads through. But during exercise, that obviously massively increases. So the blood then will return to the heart. It's what we call venous return, which sounds like it should be an 80s rock band, but it isn't. Venous return that sends the blood back to the heart, and it does it by having these valves. So the blood sort of pools behind the valves until there's enough blood there to push the valve door open and then pass on into the next section of the tube, the valve, the vein, sorry, heading back to the heart. And that's the way that the veins do it, as opposed to the arteries. The arteries do it by force of pressure, and that's why they have these muscular walls. The veins do it differently. Thin walls, because of lower pressure, they use valves to keep the blood moving. Well, I hope that's been a helpful explanation of the different kinds of blood vessels and how they relate and how they all link together to allow blood to continue to flow through the system. I'll see you in the next video. Take care.